I cannot continue this ceremony, he said, and his eyes, red-rimmed and glistening with unshed tears, fixed directly on David. Not until the truth is spoken. Not until what happened 6 months ago is brought into the light. Sarah's bouquet slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the entire church. Her mother gasped from the front row. David's best man took a step forward, confusion written all over his face, but David himself didn't move at all. He just stood there, staring at the priest with an expression that was equal parts terror and resignation, like a man who'd been waiting for this moment even as he prayed it would never come. But what do you think could make a priest stop a wedding ceremony in front of 200 people? What secret could be so devastating that it had to be revealed right there at the altar, in the most sacred moment of two people's lives? And why did David look like he'd been expecting this, like some part of him had known all along that this day of joy would turn into his worst nightmare? Drop your answers in the comments, I would like to know. The truth, when it finally came out, would shock everyone in that church. It would tear apart families, destroy friendships, and force every single person there to ask themselves what they would have done in the same situation. Because this wasn't a story about strangers or distant events. This was about real people, good people, who made choices that would haunt them forever. This was about a moment of carelessness that ended a life, a lie that poisoned a relationship, and a confession that should have stayed secret, but couldn't. This was about the price of truth and the cost of forgiveness, and it all started 2 years earlier, on a rainy Tuesday evening in Seattle, when David Chen met the woman who would change his life in ways he never could have imagined. David Chen was a software engineer at a mid-sized tech company, the kind of guy who kept his head down, did his work, and went home to his one-bedroom apartment where he'd watch old movies and order takeout. He wasn't lonely exactly, just comfortable with his own company. He'd been married once before, briefly in his early 20s, a mistake both he and his ex-wife had recognized within the first year. Since then, he'd dated here and there, but nothing serious, nothing that made him want to change his routine. Sarah Mitchell worked as a pediatric nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital, and she had a way of lighting up every room she entered. People were drawn to her warmth, her genuine kindness, the way she remembered small details about everyone she met. She'd grown up in a devout Catholic family, the youngest of 4 daughters, and her faith was woven into every part of her life. She volunteered at the church, taught Sunday school, and never missed Mass. When David met her at a mutual friend's barbecue, he was struck immediately by how she made everyone around her feel important, how she asked questions and actually listened to the answers. They started dating slowly, both of them aware that they were at an age where relationships meant something more than they had in their 20s. Within 6 months, David knew he wanted to spend his life with her. Within 8 months, he'd bought a ring. Father Michael, on the other hand, had known Sarah since she was a little girl. He'd baptized her, given her first communion, and watched her grow into the remarkable woman she'd become. When she'd come to him, glowing with happiness, to ask if he'd perform her wedding ceremony, he'd been honored. He liked David, too, found him respectful and genuine, if a bit reserved. They'd gone through the required pre-marriage counseling sessions, talked about communication and faith, and building a life together. Everything had seemed perfect. Everything had seemed blessed. On the surface, they looked like any other couple preparing for their wedding day. Sarah planned every detail with the help of her sisters, choosing flowers and music and readings that reflected their love and their faith. David went along with most of it, happy to let her have the wedding she'd always dreamed of. They argued occasionally about small things, like all couples do, but nothing serious. Nothing that made either of them question whether they were making the right choice. Their friends and family were thrilled for them. Everyone could see how happy they were together, how David softened around Sarah, how she brought out a side of him that had been hidden for years. It seemed like a love story with a guaranteed happy ending. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching from before we go any further. We would be delighted to hear from you. In order to ensure that you never miss any of our future videos, if you're new here, please click the subscribe button. But 6 months before the wedding, on a cold March night, something happened that would change all of their lives forever. David had been driving home from a late meeting, taking the back roads because there was an accident on the highway. The roads were slick with rain, visibility was poor, and he was tired, probably more tired than he should have been behind the wheel. He remembered checking his phone at a red light, remembered the light turning green, remembered accelerating through the intersection. What happened next came in flashes, fragments of memory that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A figure stepping into the crosswalk, the sickening thud of impact, the sound of his own screaming, the way the rain mixed with blood on the pavement. He'd hit someone, a man, and by the time the ambulance arrived, the man was dead. The police investigation had been thorough but ultimately inconclusive about fault. The pedestrian, a 52-year-old man named Thomas Brennan, had been jaywalking, crossing against the light. David had been going the speed limit, hadn't been drinking, and the road conditions were treacherous. The district attorney had reviewed the case and decided not to press charges. It was ruled a tragic accident, one of those horrible things that happens when rain and darkness and bad timing all converge. But David knew the truth that the police report couldn't capture. In that split second before impact, he'd been glancing down at his phone again, even though it was in his cup holder. Just a glance, maybe 2 seconds at most, but 2 seconds was enough. 2 seconds was the difference between seeing Thomas Brennan step into that crosswalk and not seeing him until it was too late. David had killed a man because he couldn't wait until he got home to check if he had any messages. The guilt ate him alive. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function. He'd go to therapy sessions and sit in silence, unable to articulate the weight crushing his chest. He'd drive to the intersection where it happened and just sit there in his car, staring at the crosswalk, trying to understand how his life had split so cleanly into before and after. Sarah knew about the accident, of course. He told her the same night it happened, shaking and sobbing in her arms. She'd been incredible, holding him through the worst of it, going with him to the police station, sitting beside him during the investigation. She'd told him over and over that it wasn't his fault, that it was a terrible accident, that he couldn't blame himself for something he had no control over. And David had let her believe that version of events. He'd let her believe that he'd done nothing wrong, that he was just the unlucky driver in a tragic circumstance. He never told her about looking at his phone. He never told her about those 2 seconds of distraction that cost a man his life. He convinced himself that it didn't matter, that telling her would only hurt her unnecessarily, that some truths were better left buried. But secrets have a way of finding the light, especially the ones we bury deepest. 3 months after the accident, David had gone to confession at St. Catherine's. He'd been raised Protestant and wasn't Catholic himself, but Sarah had been gently encouraging him to explore her faith, and he'd found something comforting about the ritual and structure of the Catholic Church. More than that, he'd found the idea of confession appealing, the thought that he could speak his guilt aloud to someone and receive absolution. He'd never been to confession before, didn't really know how it worked, but the weight of his secret had become unbearable. He needed to tell someone the truth. He needed someone to tell him he could be forgiven. Father Michael had been the priest on duty that afternoon. David had stepped into the confessional, knelt in the darkness, and when the small window had slid open, he'd begun to speak. He'd told the whole story, every detail, including the part about his phone, the 2 seconds that had killed Thomas Brennan. He'd wept as he spoke, his voice breaking, and when he'd finished, there had been a long, terrible silence from the other side of the screen. Then Father Michael had spoken, and his voice had been strange, hollow. "The man you killed," he'd said slowly. "Tell me his name again." David had told him, Thomas Brennan. Another long silence. Then, in a voice so quiet David had barely heard it, Father Michael had said, "That was my brother." The world had tilted sideways in that moment. David had sat there in the darkness of the confessional, unable to breathe, unable to think. Of all the churches in Seattle, of all the priests he could have confessed to, he'd chosen the brother of the man he'd killed. The coincidence was so cruel, so impossibly twisted, that it felt like divine punishment. Father Michael had given him absolution because that's what priests do, that's what the sacrament demands, but his voice had been mechanical, drained of warmth. He'd told David to say 10 Hail Marys and to pray for the grace to forgive himself. Then he'd asked David not to come back to St. Catherine's, to find another parish, another priest. David had understood. He'd left the church and never returned, and he'd told Sarah that he'd decided Catholicism wasn't for him, that he was more comfortable with his Protestant upbringing. She'd been disappointed but understanding, and they'd agreed that they'd raise any future children Catholic, that he'd attend Mass with her but wouldn't convert. The wedding planning had continued, the months had passed, and David had tried desperately to convince himself that the secret would stay buried, that Father Michael would honor the seal of confession, that they could all move forward. He should have known better. He should have known that some truths are too heavy to keep silent. For Father Michael, those months between the confession and the wedding were a special kind of torture. He'd go through the motions of his priestly duties, celebrating Mass, hearing confessions, visiting the sick, but inside he was being torn apart. Every time he saw Sarah at church, glowing with happiness about her upcoming wedding, he felt like he was participating in a lie. Every time she talked about David, about how kind he was, how lucky she felt, Father Michael had to bite his tongue to keep from telling her the truth. He'd pray for guidance, spend hours on his knees in front of the tabernacle asking God what he should do. The seal of confession was sacred. He couldn't violate it. But watching Sarah prepare to marry a man who was keeping such a significant secret from her felt like a betrayal of a different kind. The morning of the wedding had dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect June day that makes Seattle residents forget about all the rain they endure the rest of the year. Sarah had been radiant getting ready, surrounded by her sisters and bridesmaids, laughing and crying happy tears. David had been nervous but excited, standing in front of the mirror in his tuxedo, his best man making jokes to calm him down. Everything had felt right. Everything had felt blessed. The ceremony had started exactly on time. The processional music had played, and Sarah had walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and David had felt his throat tighten with emotion at the sight of her. She was so beautiful, so full of joy and trust and love. When she'd reached the altar and taken his hands, he'd felt, just for a moment, like maybe he could leave the past behind. Maybe he could build a future without the shadow of Thomas Brennan hanging over him. But then Father Michael had begun the ceremony, and David had noticed something wrong. The priest's hands were shaking. His voice wavered on words he'd spoken hundreds of times before. He kept pausing, losing his place in the liturgy, staring at David with an expression that made David's stomach drop. And then, just as they were about to exchange vows, Father Michael had stopped speaking entirely. The silence had stretched out, uncomfortable, and guests had begun shifting in their seats. Sarah had glanced at David with a confused smile, thinking maybe this was some kind of planned pause, some moment of reflection. But David had known. He'd seen it in Father Michael's eyes. The secret was about to come out. When Father Michael spoke those words, when he'd said he couldn't continue until the truth was spoken, Sarah had turned to David with such confusion and trust in her eyes that it had broken something in his chest. She'd expected him to be as confused as she was, expected him to defend her, to demand an explanation from the priest. Instead, she'd seen guilt written all over his face, and the confusion in her eyes had started to transform into something else, something that looked like betrayal. "David?" she'd said, her voice small. "What is he talking about?" David had opened his mouth, but no words came out. How could he explain this here, now, in front of everyone they loved? How could he tell her that he'd lied to her for months, that the accident that had traumatized him had been caused by his own negligence, that the priest marrying them was the brother of the man he'd killed? Father Michael had stepped forward, and his face had been a mask of pain and struggle. "I heard his confession 3 months ago," he'd said, his voice gaining strength. I heard him confess that he killed my brother Thomas through his own distraction, his own carelessness. And I gave him absolution, because that is my duty as a priest. But I will not, bless a marriage built on lies. I cannot watch you pledge your lives to each other when he has not been honest with you about who he really is." The church had erupted then. Sarah's father had stood up, demanding to know what was happening. David's mother had started crying. The bridesmaids had gathered around Sarah, who had gone absolutely pale, swaying on her feet like she might faint. And David had just stood there, frozen, watching his entire life collapse around him. Sarah had looked at him with tears streaming down her face and asked him one simple question: "Is it true?" And David, who had kept the secret for so long, who had convinced himself that silence was mercy, had finally told the truth. Yes. That single word had done what 6 months of silence couldn't. It had broken Sarah's heart right there at the altar. She'd taken off her veil, let it fall to the floor beside her bouquet, and walked down the aisle and out of the church without another word. Her sisters had followed, shooting David looks of pure fury. The guests had filed out in shocked silence, leaving David standing alone at the altar with Father Michael. For a long moment, neither of them had spoken. Then Father Michael had sat down heavily in one of the front pews, and David had sat beside him, and they'd both just stared at the cross above the altar. "I'm sorry," David had finally said. "For your brother. For the lie. For all of it." Father Michael had been quiet for a long time before responding. "I forgave you in that confessional," he'd said finally. "I meant it when I gave you absolution. But forgiveness doesn't mean there are no consequences. It doesn't mean you get to pretend it never happened." "I know," David had whispered. "I know that now." The weeks that followed were the hardest of David's life. Sarah wouldn't take his calls, wouldn't respond to his texts or emails. Her father had returned the ring through David's best man, along with a brief note from Sarah that simply said she needed time. David had moved through his days like a ghost, going to work, coming home, lying awake at night, replaying everything. He'd started going to therapy again, this time being completely honest about the phone, about the lies, about the secret he'd kept from the woman he loved. His therapist had asked him why he'd kept it from Sarah, and David had struggled to articulate it. Fear, maybe. Fear that she'd look at him differently, that she'd see him as someone careless, someone whose moment of distraction had ended a life. Fear that she couldn't love someone who'd done what he'd done. But keeping the secret had been its own kind of lie, and it had poisoned everything. A month after the wedding that wasn't, David had received a letter from Thomas Brennan's widow, Margaret. Father Michael had apparently told her about the confession, about David's remorse. She'd written that she didn't blame David for her husband's death, that she knew Thomas had been jaywalking, that she knew it had been an accident. But she'd also written that she appreciated knowing the full truth, that it helped her make sense of what happened. She'd invited David to visit if he ever wanted to talk about Thomas, to hear stories about who he'd been. David had broken down reading that letter, crying harder than he had since the night of the accident. The grace in Margaret Brennan's words, her willingness to see him as a flawed human being rather than a monster, had cracked something open in him. 2 months after the wedding, David had finally gotten a text from Sarah asking if they could meet. They'd chosen a coffee shop near the hospital where she worked, neutral territory. When David had arrived, she'd already been sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She'd looked tired, older somehow, but still beautiful. They'd sat in awkward silence for a few minutes before Sarah had spoken. "I've been so angry with you," she'd said quietly. "Not for the accident, not even for the distraction with your phone. I know you didn't mean to hurt anyone. I know you've been living with that guilt every day." "Then what?" David had asked, though he'd already known the answer. "For lying to me," Sarah had said, and her voice had broken. "For letting me believe a version of events that wasn't true. For deciding that you knew better than me what I could handle, what I deserved to know. For making me feel like a fool standing at that altar." David had nodded, tears streaming down his face. You're right. I was a coward. I was so afraid of losing you that I convinced myself the lie was protecting you, but I was only protecting myself." Sarah had been quiet for a long time, staring into her tea. "Father Michael came to see me," she'd said finally. "He told me about hearing your confession, about the position he was in. He said he'd been wrestling for months with whether he could perform our wedding, whether he could bless a marriage when he knew you'd been dishonest with me. He said he tried to convince himself that what you'd told him in confession had to stay secret. But that morning, standing at the altar, watching me look at you with so much trust, he couldn't do it." David had felt a fresh wave of guilt. "I put him in an impossible position. I put everyone in an impossible position." "Yes, you did," Sarah had agreed. Then she'd reached across the table and taken his hand, and David had looked up at her in surprise. "But I've spent 2 months thinking about this, praying about it, talking to my family and friends and Father Michael, and I've realized something." "What?" "That I'm angry and I'm hurt, but I still love you. And if we're going to have any chance at a future together, it has to be built on complete honesty. No more secrets, no more protecting each other from hard truths. Can you promise me that?" David had gripped her hand like a lifeline. "Yes, I promise. Complete honesty, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." They'd talked for hours that day, about the accident, about David's guilt, about the phone and the 2 seconds that had changed everything. Sarah had cried, and David had cried, and they'd both acknowledged that things would never be exactly like they'd been before. The innocence of their relationship had been shattered, but maybe they'd agreed what they could build in its place would be stronger, something real and tested rather than perfect and untouchable. Over the following months, they'd rebuilt their relationship slowly, carefully. David had started volunteering at a nonprofit that advocated for distraction-free driving, giving talks about his experience, about the real consequences of checking your phone behind the wheel. He'd met with Margaret Brennan several times, listening to her stories about Thomas, sitting with the weight of what he'd taken from her and trying to honor Thomas's memory by being honest about his mistake. 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, David and Sarah had gone back to St. Catherine's Church on a quiet weekday evening. Father Michael had been there, preparing for evening mass. When he'd seen them walk in together, he'd stopped what he was doing and just looked at them for a long moment. "We'd like to talk to you," Sarah had said, "if you're willing." They'd sat in the front pew, the 3 of them, and David had apologized again, more fully this time, for the position he'd put Father Michael in, for the pain he'd caused him by confessing to his brother's killer. Father Michael had listened, and then he'd said something David would never forget. "In the confessional, I heard your guilt and your remorse, and I gave you God's forgiveness because that is what I'm called to do. But I realized that day at the altar that I had never truly forgiven you myself. I'd been holding on to my anger and my grief, and I'd convinced myself that was acceptable because of what you'd done. But harboring that in my heart, while claiming to offer you absolution, was its own kind of lie." He'd turned to Sarah then. "I stopped your wedding because I couldn't bear to watch you enter a marriage based on deception. But I also did it out of anger, out of a desire to punish David for what he'd taken from my family. That wasn't right either. That wasn't what God called me to do." "What did he call you to do?" Sarah had asked gently. Father Michael had smiled sadly. "To forgive, truly forgive. Not just the words in a confessional, but in my heart. And to help others find their way to truth and healing, even when it's painful." They'd talked long into the evening, the 3 of them, about guilt and forgiveness, about honesty and grace, about the ways we hurt each other and the ways we can make amends. When they'd finally stood to leave, Sarah had asked Father Michael a question. "When we're ready, when we've done the work to build something real and honest between us, would you consider marrying us? Not in front of 200 people, not with all the fanfare, just us and our immediate family, and the promise to be truthful with each other no matter what." Father Michael had looked at them both for a long time, and David had seen something shift in his expression, a softening, a release of the weight he'd been carrying. "Yes," he'd said finally, "I would be honored." "So let me ask you something. If you were Sarah, standing at that altar, hearing for the first time that your future husband had been keeping such a significant secret, could you forgive him? Would you have walked away permanently, or would you have eventually found your way back to trying again? And what would it take for you to trust someone after a betrayal like that? If you were David, carrying the guilt of having caused someone's death, would you have told your partner the complete truth from the beginning? Or would you have convinced yourself that some truths are too painful to share, that withholding certain details is a form of protection rather than dishonesty? And if you were Father Michael, hearing in confession that the person seeking absolution was responsible for your own brother's death, what would you do? Could you offer genuine forgiveness in that moment? And months later, standing at the altar about to bless that person's marriage, would you stay silent or speak? These aren't easy questions. There are no right answers that work for everyone in every situation, but they're worth asking because we all face versions of these dilemmas in our own lives. We all keep secrets we think protect the people we love. We all have to decide when honesty is necessary and when it might be cruel. We all have to figure out how to forgive people who've hurt us and how to forgive ourselves for the ways we've hurt others. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Father Michael's position? Would you have stayed silent to honor the seal of confession? Or would you have spoken up to protect Sarah from marrying someone who was keeping such a significant secret? There's no easy answer, and I genuinely want to know what you think. And if this story made you think, if it made you feel something, if it challenged you to look at your own life differently, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. It helps other people find these stories, and it lets me know that this kind of honest, complicated storytelling matters to you. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories like this, stories that don't offer easy answers but ask important questions, stories about real people facing impossible choices and trying to find their way through. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. We're building a community here of people who aren't afraid to look at life honestly, who believe that truth matters even when it hurts, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Until next time.